Welcome to our webinar series on political participation and representation in the digital age. My name is Jenny Oser, and I'm a professor of politics and government at Ben-Gurion University. I'm also the principal investigator of an ERC project on this topic, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker today, Professor Ruth Dassonneville, who began a new position just this month at KU Leuven in Belgium. Ruth is a professor of political science, and among her many contributions, she is the editor of the British Journal of Political Science, which is one of the leading journals in the field. Today, she'll present an article about the gender gap in voter turnout. This article was published in the British Journal of Political Science and is co-authored with Professor Philip Kostelka of the European University Institute in Italy. And to make the most of our time together, here's how we'll run this webinar. First, Ruth will speak until the top of the hour. Second, I'll introduce our course panelists who've prepared questions in advance about the article. And third, we'll select questions that participants write to us in the chat for Q&A. So during the talk, we welcome you. Send your questions to the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts for the panelists' review. Thank you for joining us, Ruth, and the floor is yours. We have one additional technical comment that's new for this seminar. If you open up your Zoom screen all the way and you click more on the bottom right, and then click on captions, we've allowed the captions to run, so it might be easier to follow the discussion over the course of the webinar. And Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks much for the invitation, for having me, and for the opportunity to talk about some research that's been out for a while, but it's always fun to come back and to present work that is out there and talk about sort of walk you through it. And that's really the plan for today, to talk you through this paper that, as Jenny mentioned, is joint work with Philip Kostelka. And discuss sort of how we set up this paper, what the main argument is, and then talking about the results. So as Jenny mentioned, this paper was published in the BGPS a few years ago, and this really was a joint effort between Philip and myself. Both of us met at the University of Montreal, where Philip was doing a postdoc for a few years, and I was at University of Montreal as well. That's how we connected, and Philip came up with the idea to collaborate on this really fun project. So the plan for today is, as I indicated, really just to walk you through the paper, starting with the main concepts, and then talk a bit more about the research puzzle that we identified and that we thought needed more research. I'll talk a bit more about our expectations and sort of where those expectations came from. We'll spend some time on the data that we used to do this research and the methods we used, and then just present the results. And I'm sure we'll have lots of time for discussion. So this paper is, as it's already indicated in the title, is on voter turnout, and more specifically on the gender gap in voter turnout. And the sort of starting point of the paper is this idea that generally there's inequalities in voter turnout. Some people are much more likely to turn out to vote than others, and there's this observation that it's quite common in the literature, that is that women tend to turn out to vote less than men. And that gap is something that was traditionally observed. Research from, say, the 50s, 60s observed that whenever they were looking at voter surveys conducted at the time and looking at reported voter turnout, that quite systematically women were less likely to report that they had voted compared to men. And this is just an illustration of this phenomenon in national level elections across Western countries using data from Piketty and colleagues. What you see is the average reported turnout level for women in the light colored bars, and then for men in the dark blue colored bars, and quite systematically you see, systematically for all of these decades, you see that the light blue bar is somewhat lower than the dark blue bar, and that difference is more pronounced early on. And this change over time, whereby the difference has decreased a bit, has inspired more research to document and to verify whether this gender gap had been disappearing or not. Starting off first with this traditional gender gap. So that was observed definitely early on when scholars were analyzing the first sort of election studies and voter surveys, finding that women were less likely to turn out to vote. Those scholars then thought about the reasons why they were observing that trend. And they thought that it made a lot of sense that women would turn out less than men, because first of all, women had acquired the right to vote later than men. And so it made a lot of sense that women who had only just acquired the right to vote weren't as politicized, weren't as equipped to turn out to vote and to cast a ballot to choose a party compared to men. So definitely early on, 50s, 60s, it made a lot of sense that women wouldn't turn out to the same extent as men. There was also work that made the argument that for citizens, for people to turn out to vote, you need a certain number of resources. You need to be equipped to be able to navigate the political system, to figure out how to register to vote, for example, or how to figure out which party or which candidate you would want to vote for. And those resources include things like political knowledge, being informed, following media, but also time and money to some extent. And on all of those resources, we know that women are somewhat disadvantaged. Definitely, again, early on in these time series, 50s, 60s, women weren't as highly educated as men, were less likely to be employed as well. So they were lacking resources, and hence it made a lot of sense that we would observe this gender gap in voter turnout. But then, as you already saw in this graph, over time, 90s, 2000s, that gap seems to be a lot smaller. And so there were a number of scholars that observed this trend and then concluded based on that, well, those gender differences had diminished. What is more, there's even meta-analysis that was published in 2013 by Kat Smets and Caroline van Ham, that pointed out that if they were analyzing, they were looking at all the literature on the topic that was trying to explain, to predict voter turnout, they found that there was basically zero effect overall. In the aggregate, there was hardly any differences between men and women in the reported likelihood to turn out to vote. And they added that in these few studies that did find a significant difference between men and women, it was actually reversed. So they were observing either no difference, no gender gap at all, or a reversed one, whereby women would turn out to vote more than men. And that observation to us seemed really surprising. And so Philip and myself aren't quite convinced that this gender gap has completely disappeared and there's no more problem, if you will, at all. We think that it's really too early to conclude that gender gaps disappeared completely. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. First reason why we're skeptical that the gender gaps completely disappeared is that for all sorts of other types of political participation that are perhaps a bit more intensive, like volunteering as part of a campaign or becoming a member of a political party, there's quite persistent gender gaps, whereby women are less likely to, for example, become a member of a party than men. So for those types of participation, the gender gap persists, is quite strong, and doesn't seem to diminish. Second reason why we're skeptical that the gender gaps completely disappeared is that for a number of attitudinal factors, like political interest, but also things like political knowledge, again, there's persistent gender gaps. And so research that has analyzed, for example, differences in reported levels of political interest, those sorts of studies systematically find that women report lower levels of interest in politics compared to men. Those differences, again, persist. And those are important differences because political interest is one of the strongest predictors of voter turnout. And so if there's persistent differences in all sorts of political participation, and if for the main predictors of voter turnout, there's also persistent differences between men and women, then voter turnout is there's likely going to be a persistent gender gap in voter turnout as well. And this is just to illustrate the extent and the importance of those gender gaps in other indicators and political participation. This specifically looking at political knowledge, much like political interest, a really strong predictor of voter turnout. If you're more informed about politics, you're much more likely to turn out to vote. This graph that comes from some other work that I did with Ian McAllister shows the estimated effect of being women versus men on political knowledge using European election study data. And what you see here is that in every single European country, women have significantly lower levels of political knowledge than men. And so those persistent gaps ought to have consequences for participation as well. Then why exactly are we not seeing those differences or those differences less pronounced in national level elections, for example? Well, we argue that there's differences between elections and in terms of types of elections, and that there might be a diminishing of the gender gap in first order elections, but that the gender gap is still going to be present and still going to be quite important in other types of elections. And more specifically, we think that the gender gap is going to be larger and hence more visible in second order elections. And second order elections are elections where there's less at stake, or where at least voters have the impression that there's less at stake. They don't care about those elections all that much. The media covers those elections less as well. And for those sorts of elections, quite generally, we find that voter turnout is lower. If voter turnout is lower, that also means that inequalities in terms of who turns out to vote and who doesn't are going to be larger. Hence, if there's inequalities based on gender in voter turnout, those are going to be stronger, more visible for second order elections than for first order elections. Then in those second order elections, what really makes the difference between turning out to vote or not, because it's elections that seem less important, is really how much you care about politics and how psychologically involved you are in politics, how much political engagement you have, and hence how politically interested you are. Again, talking about political interest, that is one of the main attitudes where we find persistent gender gaps. All of this informs our expectations about the gender gap being still present in second order elections, and more specifically, our focus in the paper is in European Parliament elections. European Parliament elections are probably the textbook example of what second order elections are. So even though it's supranational elections, voters don't think of those elections as particularly important. They're not as interested in the European Parliament and what goes on in the European Parliament. And so turnout as a consequence is quite a bit lower for European Parliament elections than for general legislative elections or presidential elections in some countries. As an example, in 2024, voter turnout was less than 51% for the European Parliament elections. So clearly second order, and voters don't think of those elections as particularly important. Focusing on those elections, we expect to find evidence of a gender gap and a traditional one. So we expect to find that women vote significantly less than men in those types of elections. And because it's second order elections and because psychological involvement matters more to sort of make the difference between who turns out to vote and not, we think that it's interest in politics that is going to be the key variable that explains why women aren't turning out as much in European Parliament elections. So those are our two first hypotheses. Women will vote significantly less than men in European Parliament election, and that is due to the lower level of interest in politics. That is sort of the first step that we take in the paper, but we then push this whole argument a bit further and want to sort of delve a bit deeper into what exactly is going on. So assuming that there are indeed differences in voter turnout and gender differences in political interest, assuming that political interest is indeed sort of the key variable here, then that just leads to a next question, or that poses the question, then why is it that women aren't as interested in politics as men? And on that front, we seek to figure out what exactly goes on here and to theorize that context factors matter, that context factors shape the development of political interest, help us explain why some people become more politically interested than others, and why there's gender differences in political interest. And we focus on three specific context level factors here that we think can explain why women are more or less interested in politics, and hence can explain the size of this gender gap in political interest. We theorize about the role of women's representation in politics, about the overall degree of gender equality in society, and about cultural gender inequalities. And I'll walk you through the argument for each of those factors. Starting with women's representation in politics. Here, the idea is that women's representation in politics, their descriptive representation, in other words, how visible are women in politics, in parliament, for example, that matters for the development of political interest among women in particular, because of symbolical effects. That seeing that there's women in politics sort of motivates women to also develop some interest in politics, because they realize that politics isn't just a man's game, but that women can also be active in it. So there's symbolic effects, there's all sorts of role model effects that are particularly important for young women that can develop an interest in politics, because they indeed see that there's more women present. That descriptive representation, so numbers of women in politics, can also have substantive effects and can lead to a better substantive representation of women, in the sense that when there's more women elected in parliament, there's more discussion of issues that are important to women. And that as well, if there's more discussion and you think that, well, politics cares about people like me as well, so that women realize that politics is for them as well, and again, develop more political interest as a result of it. So this leads to the expectation that this gender gap in political interest reflects country level differences and the extent to which women are represented in elected offices. Our second context level variable that we consider here as something that explains why the gender gap in political interest is larger or smaller is societal gender inequalities. And here we think about differences in general overall in society in terms of how much inequality, gender inequality there is in work and home, with regard to pay, with regard to health, really how gender equal is society. And we assume that if society overall is more gender equal, then there's also going to be a smaller gender gap in political interest. Contrast this to countries where there's really large inequalities in all sorts of domains, in terms of education, in terms of work, and in terms of pay or health. In those types of societies, we suspect that there's also going to be really large inequalities in terms of how politicized people become and how interested they are in politics. There's some research that has indicated that there's an association between societal gender inequality and the gender gap in political interest. So this then leads to the following hypothesis, that the gender gap in political interest reflects the overall level of gender equality in a society. Our final indicator that we consider is again more at the societal level, not directly related to politics as such, but concerns traditional gender roles and gender stereotypes. To what extent are we talking about a society where men and women learn that there's certain roles that are for them because of their gender, where boys and girls learn, for example, that there's some things that are only for boys and other things that are only for girls. in societies where those gender norms or norms about what are the roles for women and what are the roles for what are the roles for women, what are the roles for men, in societies where those norms get passed on, get reproduced, and people get socialized into those norms, we suspect that politics is also going to be one of these domains where people learn which is their role based on their gender. So that boys would learn that politics is something for them, and that girls would learn that politics is not for them, that politics is something for boys. We think that in societies where there's those gender roles, that there's also going to be a larger gender gap in political interest. So leading to our fifth and final hypothesis. To summarize the overall argument, what we're doing in this paper, we start off by looking at gender differences in voter turnout. So are women less likely to turn out to vote than men? We theorize that there's going to be such a difference for European Parliament election, and that is explained by differences in political interest. So political interest is the mediating variable here. And then in the second step, we seek to better explain in which conditions, in which contexts, especially there's going to be large gender gaps in political interest and hence in political participation. And we theorize that that is a function of societal and context level factors like women's representation, societal gender inequality, and those cultural factors, gender norms. To test our expectations, we make use of data from the European election study, the voters surveys specifically, and we pull 8 surveys, the 8 surveys that were available at the time when we started this project, so running up until 2014. This gives us a huge number of observations across 29 countries. In terms of the analysis, our first or initial outcome variable is going to be voter turnout. So did the respondent in one of these surveys turn out to vote in European Parliament elections, yes or no? So we're analyzing self-reported voter turnout, which has been debated, has been discussed. We're aware of the fact, and we acknowledge that self-reported voter turnout is going to lead to an overestimation of turnout. But we don't think that that is particularly problematic if you're interested in differences, gender differences in voter turnout. We're looking at differences based on respondent sex in voter turnout, and then first of all, look at the role of sex and whether that's mediated by political interest, and then in a second step, examine the role of those context level factors in explaining gender differences in political interest. For 3 context level variables, I'll take a bit more time to talk about personalization and how we capture those concepts. For women's descriptive representation, we use an indicator of the percentage of women in parliament. So what share of the MPs in parliament, we're looking at the most important chamber in context where there's, for example, a parliament as well as a senate, and looking at the percentage of MPs that are women. We do this in 2 ways. First approach is just to look at the percent of women in parliament at the time of the survey. And note that this is the national level parliament. We're not looking at the European Parliament because voters are influenced by the national context mostly. Second approach is to not look at the percent of women in parliament at the time of the survey, but instead to consider the percent of women in parliament at a time when a respondent voted for about the first time. So when the respondent was about 18, 21 years old, we follow that operationalization because that is potentially the time when people are most influenced by politics and the political environment around them and form their political interests, for example. Then for societal gender inequality, we use an index that's been made available by the European Institute for Gender. And this is a fairly comprehensive indicator that combines information on gender equality, gender inequality in all sorts of domains related to power, to health, to education, and so forth. And then finally, and this requires potentially the most time, cultural gender inequality. So as indicated, we're interested in capturing the extent to which men, women, boys, girls learn about gender roles and learn that some things are for men, other things are for women. To capture this, to tap this, we decided to make use of results on test scores, on standardized tests on mathematics, and looking at the extent to which there's a differences in mathematics scores between boys and girls. Two standardized tests here that we're looking at, the PISA tests that are conducted when kids are about 14 years old, and then the TIMSS, which is conducted among 10-year-olds. We make the argument that if there's significant differences in how boys and girls perform on these tests, on these exams, that can only be a result of the fact that girls in particular have learned that mathematics is not for them. It's too difficult, too hard, and it's more of a boys thing. Suggesting that gender roles and norms are really important in society, and even young kids already get socialized into those norms. In societies, hence, where there's a large difference between how girls and boys perform on these scores, we expect that there's also going to be large differences in how interested men and women are in politics. All right, on to the results then. So as I indicated, we do this in 2 steps. We start off by first looking at the gender gap in voter turnout, looking at this over time, and then in the second step, we'll focus more on gender differences in political interest and try to explain those. Starting off with the gender gap in voter turnout, our expectation was that there would be a gender gap in voter turnout for European Parliament elections because it's second-order elections. And that is indeed what we find. So you see all European Parliament elections that were included in our study, and for each election, there's 2 coefficients that are shown. The black coefficients focus only on those countries that were already a member state of the European Union in 1979. So by comparing the black circles, you're looking at it's consistently the same countries that we're looking at. And what we see for all of those countries is that systematically, women are less likely to report to have voted in the European Parliament election compared to men. That difference is about 2-3 percentage points. So we see it in 1979, all the way up until 2014. 2014, it's not at all smaller than it was in 1979, for example. It's not always significant, but it's always there, and the size of the gap doesn't really vary much. The second set of coefficient looks at all member states of the European Union. So those coefficients are going to be affected by new member states joining, and perhaps some of these new member states, there's really high turnout because they're voting for the first time, so that influences the comparisons a bit. But overall, we don't see huge differences between the 2 coefficients. Regardless of how we look at this, there's a gender gap that just to be sure, isn't huge, but it's always there, it's quite persistent. Now, you might be concerned that we stopped the time series in 2014, which is by now more than 10 years ago, and that 2014 in particular, there was a quite sizable gender gap. So just for today, I also added some more recent data in 2019, 2024, and what you see there is that the results are actually really similar to 2014. So that gender gap still there, still present, even in the most recent elections. What we do see is that there's quite some variation between countries in that gender gap. And what you see here is, again, 2 sets of coefficients. The hollow coefficients show the gender gap, so the effect of being women versus men on the likelihood to report turning out to vote in European Parliament elections. And what you see is that in the huge majority of countries, that coefficient is negative. It is negative and statistically significant in a lot of countries as well. And there's a few exceptions. There's a few countries where, in fact, women are more likely to turn out to vote than men. But those coefficients aren't always statistically significant. What we also note is that if you look at the gender gap in national level elections, that gender gap, that coefficient, tends to be smaller than it is for European Parliament elections, which is consistent with our expectation that the gender gap is going to be more visible, more present when we look at second order elections. So we find that there is a gender gap that is quite persistent over time. Our second expectation was that this gender gap is due to persistent differences in levels of political interest between men and women. And we look at that in different ways, and I'll focus here on the regression approach that we use to investigate this. So what you see here is a series of linear probability models in which we're explaining voter turnout, reported voter turnout in European Parliament elections. In the first model, we're just including an indicator of respondent sex. And what you see then is that on average, across these elections and across countries, women are significantly less likely to turn out to vote compared to men, a gap that is about 2 percentage points. In the next few models, we step by step add controls to see if we can explain away this difference in voter turnout. We start by adding a number of socio-demographic controls, which should account for some of the resource differences that there are between men and women. We account, for example, for employment status, for social class, as well as for levels of education. When we do so, the gender gap really doesn't move much. The coefficient is slightly reduced, but really social demographic variables do not seem to explain why women turn out to vote less than men. In the next step, we add some attitudinal controls because we're analyzing European Parliament elections. We're notably accounting for attitudes vis-a-vis the European Union. Are people in favor or not of the European Union? When we do so, the gender gap's reduced, so attitudes do matter, but it's still present, it's still there, and it's still significant. In the fourth model, we add even more controls. And here we add a really strong control, for example, for whether people are partisans or not. And again, this somewhat reduces the effect, but we can't fully explain it away. We can only fully explain it away in the final model. And the final model is where we add political interest as an independent variable in the model. And what we note first is that, as expected, political interest is a super important predictor and super strong predictor of voter turnout. The more interested are much more likely to turn out to vote in European Parliament elections. And interestingly, when we add political interest to the model, the coefficient of on gender, the coefficient on being female versus male changes, basically flips side. Meaning that once we control for how politically interested individuals are, and when we're comparing men and women that are equally politically interested, women in fact turn out more than men. So really coming to the conclusion that political interest is the key variable that explains this gender gap in voter turnout in second order elections. In the paper, we then also use an alternative approach to test the same expectation, basically verifying the role of political interest and explaining the gender gap in voter turnout, where we sort of formally test this by means of a decomposition analysis. I won't sort of go into details of that, but just mention that the basic takeaway of that analysis is that we can explain 100% of the gender gap just with information on political interest alone. So that is really the key variable. So in terms of our first two expectations, our first two hypotheses, we indeed find that women vote less than men in European Parliament elections, and that is due that that difference, that gap, traditional gender gap that we find is driven by differences in interest in politics. Then obviously the question is then why are women in some settings less interested in politics than men? So here we shift the outcome variable and now focus on political interest and try to explain variation between countries in that gender gap in political interest. So technically we're looking at cross-level interactions where we're interacting some context level variable with gender to predict political interest. And so we want to know if the effect of being female on political interest varies by some societal level, things like how many women are present in parliament and how is the society doing in terms of gender inequality, and then our indicator of cultural gender inequalities. The results here take the form of average marginal effects plots that show or that visualize this cross-level interaction. So in every case, we're showing you the average marginal effect of being female versus male. You'll see that consistently that coefficient is negative, which signifies that women are less likely to turn out to vote than men in those European Parliament elections. We show that coefficient as a function of variation on that context level indicator, starting here with our indicators of women's political representation, so the percentage of women in parliament, or the percentage of women in parliament at the time when the respondent voted for the first time. When we look at the percent of women in parliament, first graph here to the left, and we see that there's a positive slope here, which is indicating that as there's more women in parliament, that negative coefficient is reduced somewhat in strength or in size. The effect of the percentage of women in parliament, however, is not statistically significant. We do find a significant reduction of the gender gap when we consider the percentage of women in parliament at the time when a respondent voted for the first time. So there's some evidence, it seems, that descriptive representation matters, and that women that people that grow up in settings where there's more women represented in parliament, where almost 50% of MPs are women, that in those settings, there's smaller differences between how interested men and women are. For societal gender equality, so this indicator that captures inequality in society across domains, we basically find zero indication that this is moderating the size of the gender gap in voter turnout. It's consistently of about the same size, and it doesn't really matter how gender equal society is overall. What we find does matter and seems to be a pretty strong and powerful predictor of these differences, of this variation in gender gaps in political interest, are indicators of cultural gender differences, or indicator of the extent to which people learn that some things are for boys and other things are for girls. We see that in contexts where girls perform a lot worse than boys on the PISA scores, for example, that there's a really sizable gender gap in voter turnout of about 10 percentage points. That gender gap gets almost halved. So it's almost reduced by half in settings where there's hardly any difference in math scores between boys and girls, or where girls are doing even slightly better than boys. So in settings, it seems, where there's no gender norms that get passed on and that people get socialized into, the gender gap in political interest is a lot smaller. This matters because, again, political interest is one of the main determinants of voter turnout. So ultimately, in settings where there's much reduced gender gap in political interest, there's also going to be a much reduced gender gap in voter turnout as well. So in terms of our context level hypotheses, the evidence for the third hypothesis is somewhat mixed. It depends on which indicator we're using. If we're focusing on long-term effects, and there's a bit more evidence, but that doesn't really hold when we add the other controls. We don't find any indication that societal gender inequality matters, but those cultural norms seem to be key. Just to summarize the results, in second-order elections, we have argued, and the evidence shows, women are still less likely to vote than men. So the traditional gender gap is still present. It's just not visible in all types of elections. You have to look at second-order elections to see it. And this gender gap can be explained by important differences in political interest between men and women. These gender differences in political interest then can seem to be linked to context level factors, and more specifically by differences in gender norms and stereotypes that people get socialized into. All of this shows we think that the gender gap in electoral participation is quite persistent. It's stable over time, and even the last few elections, that gender gap still seems to be present. And it's persistent because it's connected to differences in psychological involvement for which still women show lower levels of interest in politics. And the fact that those are connected with largely stable societal traditions, norms, stereotypes has implications for the likelihood that this is going to change. My takeaway from all of this is that if there's going to be change in this gender gap in voter turnout, it's going to be a very slow process, because it really requires generations and generations and new generations coming into the electorate that have been socialized in a different environment, where the norms and gender norms that they've learned, that they've gotten used to, have completely changed to be more gender equal. I think I've come to the end of the slides. I hope that I respected the time more or less, and I look forward to the questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Ruth, for this excellent presentation. You already answered a number of the questions we came up in class, including doing entirely new analyses just for us and showing that beyond the 2014 endpoint of the paper, up until now, that gap still exists. So thanks for that. And now we're going to do 2 rounds of Q&A. I first want to welcome everyone who feels comfortable to go ahead and open up your cameras. You all have the capacity to do that on your own. And we're going to have a first round of questions that will come from our course panelists. We all read the paper carefully in advance. They'll facilitate the Q&A with me and ask the questions one after another to Ruth. And a reminder to all of you who are here as participants, we welcome you to send to us as co-hosts any questions in the chat that you'd like to have considered for Q&A. And I want to note, we're honored to have here a number of leading international experts on both gender and political behavior research. So I'm going to note some who are here. I may miss some. We have Liran Harzgor from the University of Haifa. We have Marta Koznicka from the Polish Academy of Sciences, Lawrence Ezra from the University of Essex in England, and Haleli Pinson from Ben-Gurion University. We welcome everyone to ask questions during the Q&A and are glad to have such a wonderful group here today. So I'm going to now introduce our first course panelist, Tamar Hajjaj, who is a second-year BA student. Tamar.
Hi. So my question is, your article identified a gender gap in voter turnout in a content that hadn't been studied before, namely of European Parliament elections. We are interested to hear if the research made you curious about how the gender gap might differ in other contexts around the world.
Yeah, and this first round of questions will give time, Ruth, for you to answer them one after another. So go ahead and answer that first question.
All right, good. Thank you. Yeah, really good question. I think based on our argument, I'd say that it depends on the nature of the election. If it's an election that could be characterized as second order, that would mean that people don't think of the election as all that important and are much less likely to turn out to vote. So it's elections where turnout is lower, then I would anticipate that there's going to be a gender gap, and there's going to be a gender gap that looks like the gender gap that we identify here, with women turning out less than men. Now we're using this framework of second order elections, but there's this much debates in the literature on what exactly counts as a second order election, and there's no real consistency between countries, for example, in what are second order elections. In some countries, local elections, municipal elections, for example, are clearly going to be second order because people don't think of those elections as really important, that they don't bother to turn out to vote. Those are clearly second order elections. But in other settings, municipal elections are thought of as really important by voters, and they turn out in really high numbers to those elections. So really what I think is key is not necessarily the type of election that we're talking about, but how much mobilization there is, how high is turnout in those elections. If it's a high turnout election that mobilizes people, then women as well are going to be mobilized, turn out to vote, and the gender gap is going to be really small. If, on the other hand, we're talking about an election where people don't care all that much, or they're not interested, they don't think it's that important, then turnout is going to be a lot lower, and all sorts of inequalities are going to be more pronounced, including gender inequalities.
Thanks, Ruth. Our next question is from Matan Abdu, who is a third-year BA student.
Thanks, Ruth. My question is a little bit long. So your paper cites peer research that interprets the gender gap in mathematical performance to reflect a long-term cultural traits. But I wonder if a different interpretation could be that these math scores actually reflect educational difference. And this different interpretation could also affect the concluding recommendation, in addition to the article suggestion to focus on having public policy more directly target cultural representation stereotype. Do you think it's possible that another useful strategy could be to focus on advancing education quality between boys and girls?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. We think that these measures, so those gender gaps in maths test scores, are a really good proxy of gender norms in society, and but they could be capturing all sorts of other things as well. We think they're capturing cultural norms, and in the paper we show some evidence that these indicators correlate, for example, with self-reported attitudes on what the position of women in society should be. So it does seem to correlate with more attitudinal measures that more directly tap gender norms, which is something that reassured us and that led us to think that we're really using a measure that is fit here. In terms of educational quality, I guess that much like what holds for other things, if everyone scores really highly on the test because education is super performant, then there's not going to be many gaps or many inequalities in those math scores either. So for sure, it's going to be correlated with the quality of education in that sense. The sort of more substantive response I'd give, though, is that in terms of how to invest in education, it's probably not only about the sort of quality and performance of education, but also about the sorts of values that get passed on through the education system. And that irrespective of the quality of your education, if through all sorts of ways and perhaps implicitly through your educational system, boys and girls get sort of learn about gender norms and roles and get socialized into these sort of more traditional gender norms, then that would still be a problem.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Ruth. And our last question in this first round of Q&A is from Ben Moshe, a second-year BA student. And a reminder, we already had a number of excellent questions that came in the chat. If you have a question that you'd want us to consider for the second round of Q&A, put it in the chat to any of us who are defined as co-hosts, and we'll consider them for the second round of Q&A. So now to Or.
Thank you first for for your presentation. And my question is, your study focuses on 3 different explanations for why political interests might differ in different contexts. Women's representation in politics, the country's overall degree of gender equality, and the culture, gender inequalities. Especially since some of your earlier research identified the importance of women's representation in politics, I'm curious if you were surprised that this article found cultural sources to be more important.
Surprised. Not sure I'm surprised. Well, the first and reassuring observation was that if you look at it in the without adding the cultural controls, then women's representation also matters or also correlates in expected ways. My interpretation of these findings and sort of why that effect is no longer significant when we add culture, and why culture seems to matter more, is that culture is just culturally so much deeper, and to some extent the share of women that is elected in parliament is also going to be reflective of those cultural gender norms in a society. So we're adding something that is causally deeper than the percent of women in parliament. So women in parliament can still matter, but we're adding something that already explains why there's so many more women in parliament in some countries than in others, and hence it's logical to some extent that that percent of women in parliament by itself is no longer adding anything to that sort of really deep causal effect that we've already added to the model.
Okay, thanks, Ruth. So we're now proceeding to our second round of Q&A. How we'll approach this is we're going to ask the questions one after another that have come in the chat. I'll read out our first one, and then we'll proceed to our student panelists. Some of the questions also relate to ones that we brainstormed in class, and then you can do a final round, Ruth, of answering whatever you have time for and interest to most focus on. So we had a great question that came in from Dr. Liran Harzgor, not a surprise of the creativity of the question. Maybe women make better use of their time and resources by not voting in unimportant elections, is the question from Liran. Let's now proceed to our student panelists to see what they chose from among the questions. And here we'll start with Tamar. I think you're on mute. Seems it's not unmuting. I'll ask the question that is in the area there for Tamar. It's, were there any unexpected patterns in the data that you found particularly surprising or thought-provoking? And now we'll proceed here to Matan, whatever question you want to select from those submitted.
Let's see. This study focused on the gender gap in the levels of voter turnout in the European Parliament and finds the gap is fairly stable over time. We are curious to hear your thoughts on related type on gender gap in voting, which is that women tend to vote more to the left and men more to the right, and the fact that this gap seems to be growing in some contexts, especially in the recent US national elections.
Yeah, and I'll add in there was a new working paper that was publicized today in social media by Ruben Matheson that shows by girls and boys that gap is increasing meaningfully. The last question in this round, whichever question or has selected. Yeah.
Okay. This paper seems to be excellent combination of the prior research by both co-authors that is cited in the paper, including prior research by you on women's representation and by Philip Kostelka on different types of elections. I'm curious to hear how you both saw the connection in each other's prior work and decided to write this paper, and also whether you see natural extensions of this current paper in your work or for other researchers.
Okay, and one last question that just came in from Lawrence Ezro, who asked, he has 2 questions. Do men overreport voting more than women? an interesting question, as overreporting is a key issue with empirical study of voting. And second, do you think that the European Parliament is less representative of women compared to national parliaments? So 5 minutes, many amazing questions. Ruth, it's up to you what you want to round out with.
Okay, I'll try to go through all of them quickly.
Okay.
That will be the strategy. First, I'll react to Liran's reaction, which I really like. That could be one interpretation, but on the flip side, those perceptions of what are important elections aren't always correct. The fact that people think European Parliament elections are not important is actually not a good perception, or it's sort of false to think that those elections do not matter. Most legislation results from what happens in the European Parliament. So people should care more about those elections, and the women as well should care more about how well they're represented there. I won't talk to the unexpected patterns because this has been too long ago to sort of remember the surprises. For sure, there's always surprises when you do these sort of things, but there's nothing that sort of comes to mind right away. In terms of the ideological gender differences, this is something that I've looked into previously, but not with super recent data. And in my previous work, I found that there wasn't much change, or sort of there has been a change with women shifting towards the left, but then I found that sort of leveled off a bit and remained pretty stable. There's a lot really recent work coming out now that tends to show that is changing, that the very youngest generation is different, and that gender gaps are more important there. My take on this is that for now it's still too early to tell if that is going to be a stable trend, or if there's just something contextual. It also seems that scholars find really different results depending on what types of data they look at, what countries they look at. So I'm still careful with this, and don't want to sort of take too strong conclusions on this being a major shift or change. I think only time will tell if this is something real and something persistent. I'll maybe talk about the what would be logical next steps of this research, because the sort of the connection in how this paper came about was sort of just happened naturally. It's mostly Philip taking the initiative and thinking, well, we should do something about this, and he saw the connection, he saw the link, and then it just evolved. The logical next step, I think, would be to test this more systematically with much more variation in types of elections, than not just looking at European Parliament elections, but pooling all sorts of elections. In the paper itself, we mentioned that it would be really interesting to test this with local elections. But then there's data issues, and it's really hard to find data that allow you to analyze predictors of voting in local elections in a comparable fashion, where scholars are asking the exact same questions across countries for those sorts of elections. And then to Lauren's questions, the over-reporting is when we wrote the paper and in the review process, that question actually came up, which is why there's a paragraph in the paper that sort of addresses that a bit, where at the time when we were doing the research, we didn't find any indications that that men would be more likely to over-report than women. And we came to that conclusion, amongst others, because of a paper by Morin-Chassé and others that tested the impact of having a face-saving question in the voter turnout report question. So where people get a chance to say, I usually vote, but not this time. And so they conducted an experiment to see how that improves or reduces over-reporting of turnout. The treatment itself is successful, but they did not find evidence that the treatment has differential effects based on gender. So men and women are responding exactly the same way to that treatment, which we took as an indication that potentially that tendency to over-report is going to be stable. I know that since there's a few papers that suggest that maybe there are differences, there are gender differences in over-reporting, and then that might introduce bias in our analysis if that's indeed correct. And then are women less well represented in the European Parliament? I guess that would be the implication of our findings and of our results. But that would only be the case if women have systematically different ideological preferences and party preferences than men, which there's some evidence that they're more left-leaning, more progressive, at least on some issues. So that would indeed be the implication. To what extent that leads to a real disadvantage in terms of substantive representation, I think that's a whole research agenda that I hope some people are going to put in practice.
And perhaps some of the people who are here in this Zoom. And one of the lines of future work that you noted as potential was one we wondered about in class, about adding a broader global reach. So thank you so much to Ruth for presenting, to our panelists for leading the Q&A, and to participants for asking such great questions. We welcome everyone to join us again. The final webinar of the series this semester is with Professor Yotam Margalit of Tel Aviv University in 2 weeks, January 22nd, on the political consequences of green policies. We look forward to seeing you then, and thanks to everyone.